try to share my screen. So are you seeing presenter view or just normal? Okay. All right. So today's talk is about my dissertation, which is called Queering Suicide, Why Necropolitical Archives of Trauma and Resilience in AIDS Activism Matter. So just a brief content warning. Obviously, this is going to be talking about suicide and HIV/AIDS, but it'll also be discussing queer phobia, racialized violence, classism. There are going to be some very intense and difficult quotes, as well as images of protests that will be maybe difficult to view as well. And I wanted to start this talk with a quote from Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. In 1993, she wrote at the beginning of her book, Tendencies, "I think everyone who does gay and lesbian studies is haunted by the suicides of adolescents." So my work on this public talk, it didn't begin this year. It actually began when I was 12 years old. When I was in grade 7, we had to write speeches for our English class, and I did mine on suicide. And I don't remember why or how I even knew what suicide was at that age. And a friend of mine did hers on homophobia, I think because she saw me getting bullied because people assumed my sexuality before I knew it myself. So it feels very full circle to be talking about this with you all today. So today I'm going to discuss my journey throughout this dissertation and my journey towards some semblance of hope. I'll start by introducing the dissertation. We're going to go chapter by chapter. So I'll talk a little bit about the theoretical basis of this dissertation in the context of necropolitics, as well as theories on queer trauma. And we'll discuss a little bit some of the statistics that motivated me to do this work. Then I'm going to explore sort of queer necropolitical approaches to AIDS. So I'm going to be kind of mining AIDS history for potential activist approaches that could be used in suicide prevention. Because currently both AIDS and suicide are done through an individual social service model. And in the past, AIDS was dealt with through a highly structural form of activism that looked at intersectional oppression. After that, I'll talk a little bit about different suicide prevention initiatives, critiquing the It Gets Better campaign, and we'll also look at what people who have killed themselves have to say about those things, or had to say about those things before they died. I'll be exploring the nonprofit industrial complex, some of the challenges of how funders can limit our ability to work. And I'll also be discussing ways to work alongside the nonprofit industrial complex, but not containing the entirety of a social movement inside of it. After that, I'm going to give sort of a structural community toolkit. So there's going to be some examples as to things that increase suicidality and how we could work on those structurally. So this is more of a thought experiment. I'm not saying that these are the only things that impact suicide, but I'm trying to encourage you to think about how we can use the assets of AIDS activism and apply them in contemporary times. And then we'll conclude with a short meditation on hope. So there have been several studies over the last decade that have explored how queer people and trans people have significantly higher suicide rates than heterosexual people. And in a necropolitical context, what's really important to note is that this is intensified for people of color and Indigenous people. Suicide is also estimated to have surpassed AIDS-related illness as the leading cause of death of gay men in Canada as of 2007. This could be for a lot of reasons. There were huge advances in pharmacological HIV prevention and treatment, but it also denotes an underlying suicide crisis. And when I read this statistic, I had been working at an AIDS service organization, and it had been less than 2 years since my ex-boyfriend died by suicide, and he was among 8 people I knew who had taken their own lives in New Brunswick. So at the time, a gay health organization was consulting my agency, looking to get some input on what their strategic plan could be for their future. And I mentioned the statistic, and I said maybe you could do some of your programming on suicide prevention, given that that is now the leading cause of of death of queer men in Canada. And it was immediately shut down. They just said we're not funded to do suicide prevention. And it seemed almost as if I was being ridiculous by suggesting that they expand their programming. I began to think about the fierce activism of organizations such as the AIDS Coalition Unleash Power, called ACT UP, and AIDS Action Now in Toronto, and how different this was from the individual social service approaches that I saw when I was working at the AIDS Service Organization, and that I had saw in my previous work before that at a suicide helpline, and I decided to go to grad school. So this work examines sort of what can be learned from the AIDS crisis to be applied to suicide prevention. And I foreground this with the theoretical frameworks of queer necropolitics and queer trauma. And I want to just start with this quote by Victor Rousseau. He said this in 1988. He said, "Living with AIDS is like living through a war, which is only happening for the people who happen to be in the trenches. Every time a shell explodes, you look around and discover you've lost more of your friends, but nobody else notices. It isn't happening to them. They're walking through the streets, or they're walking the streets as though we weren't living through some sort of nightmare, and you can only hear the screams of the people who are dying and their cries for help. Only you can hear these. No one else seems to be noticing." So this was during the height of the AIDS crisis, and we saw an immediacy of response from AIDS activists, definitely not an immediacy of response from governments. But we don't have that same urgency around suicide prevention in the queer community right now beyond the crisis moment of the intervention when the person is about to kill themselves. So there's no sustained structural response outside of the crisis moment. So Achilles Mbembe developed his framework of necropolitics, what he terms power over death, in contrast to Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics, or what Foucault has termed power over life. And this is the power to confer premature death onto certain populations. This theory is not limited to murder itself, though it can be. It also accounts for the failure to foster the life of a population. So a quote from him is, "I've put forth the notion of necropolitics and necropower to account for the various ways in which, in our contemporary world, weapons are deployed in the interest of maximum destruction of persons and the creation of death worlds, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life conferring upon them the status of living dead." And Jasbir Puar was the first to articulate necropolitics in her book on homonationalism, though she didn't really discuss her use of the term at length, so there's not a lot of quotable material there. But she does argue that it's time to ask questions such as which queers are folded into life. And I think what she's getting at is that it's assimilable Western white queers who are more likely to be fitted into homonormative life due to their legibility and usefulness to Western nation states in homonationalist times. So my argument is in part that queer necropolitics has kind of retooled its techniques from the death from AIDS-related illness as a more overt form of ending queer life to the less overt distribution of death through suicide. And this personification and this kind of metaphorical use of things is intentional in order to deepen our understanding of the stakes at hand. And so I talked about Mbembe's concept of death worlds, and my work contributes an understanding of what I term the cis-hetero death world to research on queer necropolitics and AIDS. So Mbembe explores the concept of death worlds in his examples of the plantation, the colony, and the concentration camp. And using Puar's queer necropolitics, I argue that the AIDS pandemic and the contemporary suicide crisis for queer people can be understood as existing in a temporal cis-hetero death world. We also see the threat of physicality in death worlds. We saw ACT UP's response to threats of AIDS quarantine, so the forcible quarantine of people living with HIV. This was a highly likely possibility So they marched in the 1987 New York Pride Parade with a concentration camp float. So this demonstrates an activist response to necropolitics and a cis-hetero death world before the terms existed. And like I said, cis-hetero death worlds are not unique to material spaces of murder, though such spaces do exist, such as the gay purge camps in Chechnya, Russia. But my contention is that cis-hetero death worlds can be an omnipresent structural system that exposes queer people to premature death in a certain time period. I also talk a lot about trauma in my work. Anne Sveckovich explicitly resists the diagnosis of PTSD and instead examines queer trauma as an often everyday repeated experience. And she argues that trauma cultures, which are public cultures formed around trauma, can have therapeutic effects that extend beyond the limits of a private therapeutic encounter and can be a force for social change. So she formulates this idea of queer trauma cultures, which is kind of the basis of my dissertation. So the theory can give voice to the pain of living in a world where queer people are subjugated and subjected to premature death. And it also explores what can come out of that as well. So by connecting queer trauma cultures with post-traumatic growth, I expand on this a little bit. In previous published work, I wrote a chapter that coined this idea of queer community post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth is almost solely discussed in an individual context. So for example, when people leave abusive situations, often their lives change in really dramatic ways. They do things they always wanted to, like going back to school, for example, and having a deeper sense of spirituality. My contention is that we can also look at post-traumatic growth in communities. So I coined this in past work and I develop it much further in this dissertation. And I propose that there was a queer community post-traumatic growth that followed the height of the AIDS crisis, sort of this queer collective consciousness of resilience and activist knowledge that queers can tap into if we stretch our minds beyond these solely individual social service approaches to dealing with the manifestations of structural issues that actually function necropolitically. So queer trauma cultures, communities of post-traumatic growth, queer trauma cultures of activism and of caring continue to have a dramatic impact on the AIDS pandemic. And my assertion is that these can be resourced and we can redeploy these methods for combating the conditions that lead to queer suicide. So what I'm doing with chapter 2 is I'm really mining AIDS history for potential activist approaches that we can use in suicide prevention, and I'm suggesting a return to that earlier direct activism. And this return would be beneficial for continued HIV prevention as well as for suicide prevention. So I'm sort of telling a story in which earlier in AIDS activism, there was this huge community response. There was a collective response of structural activism, of large-scale protests that explored a variety of intersections. And there was also individualized care. Now, it has been my observation that there is almost exclusively, and I say almost exclusively because there is a minority of structural activism, but there's largely individual medical social service, pharmacological treatment and prevention, and case management. So there's this professionalization of AIDS work. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have that at all, but we shouldn't contain the entirety of AIDS work in working in case management. And with suicide prevention, my contention is that it's kind of always been focused on individual psychological care, suicide helplines. We'll talk about the It Gets Better movement in a bit. And I'm looking to move towards reviving AIDS activists' collective responses to looking at the intersecting structural issues that are causing people to want to kill themselves. And of course, we would continue to have individual care. So I analyzed 3 documentary films in this chapter, and I do this because it allows an affective connection between the viewer and those who lived through the crisis. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those films. And as I do, I really want you to keep this question in mind of how might this same activism be applied to the larger structures that impact queer suicide prevention. So the first film I explore is How to Survive a Plague. It explores the work of ACT UP and the Treatment Action Group. There's really powerful footage of die-ins where people would lay on the ground and pretend they're dead to symbolize the deaths that were being caused due to inaction on the AIDS crisis. There's footage of die-ins such as those held at the National Institute of Health due to a lack of research into HIV treatment, and at St. Patrick's Cathedral due to the very influential Cardinal O'Connell, who made some homophobic remarks and did not believe in condom use. It also shows footage of a protest where ACT UP members put a giant 35-foot condom over Senator Jesse Helms' house due to his lack of action on AIDS and his homophobic remarks. It talks about the ashes action. So you'll see that in the image on the left, where people were throwing the ashes of their dead lovers, their dead friends, their dead family members over the gates of the White House. And on the image on the right, you'll see a political funeral where people literally paraded the dead bodies of people who had died of AIDS through the streets. So the film has some really powerful protest footage that we could redeploy for suicide prevention, but it also largely focuses on this narrative that AIDS activism was almost solely about getting drugs into bodies. So developing drugs, getting treatment, getting prevention, and getting those into the hands of people who needed them. And it certainly was, but in part. But this fails to capture the many other aims of AIDS activism, such as feminist activism. In many ways, it was feminists who taught AIDS activists how to do activism. And there was a lot of activism around women's issues, which were impacting HIV and AIDS. Anti-war activism, as well as anti-racist activism, because there was this understanding that these issues were interconnected, but that's not shown in this particular film. And due to the film's focus on white gay male heroism in New York mostly, it perpetuates the false notion that ACT UP was a white gay male organization, and it erases the histories of racialized people and women's activism. ACT UP had many affinity groups that were specific to different communities and different issues. So United in Anger is a different film that I also analyze, and this actually uses some of the same footage of How to Survive a Plague, but the story it tells is very different. And it explores ACT UP as a diverse organization consisting of coalitions among marginalized groups. And it understands AIDS as being impacted by racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, among other issues. It has footage of protests against the 2003 Iraq War, the 1991 Gulf War. It discusses ACT UP's work on homelessness, as well as its work for people who use drugs and people with experiences in the prison system. And earlier I talked about a protest at a cathedral, and that same protest at St. Patrick's Cathedral is that's showed in How to Survive a Plague is shown in United in Anger. But in United in Anger, they explain that this was actually a partnership between ACT UP and an organization called Women's Health and Action Mobilization. It was not just about AIDS, it was also about attacks on women's reproductive rights. And they discuss ACT UP's 4-year project to change the CDC's definition of AIDS. So you cannot catch AIDS, you can only acquire HIV. AIDS is the advanced clinical stage of HIV, and it's defined by certain things, one of which is opportunistic infections. So infections that take advantage of a weakened immune system, and that is a symbol that the immune system is very weak, and then a diagnosis gets moved to AIDS. And at the time, and for some social programs like disability, you needed an AIDS diagnosis to be able to go on, for example, disability. But the opportunistic infections that defined AIDS at the time were the ones that impacted men. They were not the ones that impacted women. And so it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for a woman to get a diagnosis of AIDS, and therefore impossible for a woman to get on disability. So ACT UP, over 4 years of very intense protests, of storming the CDC, changed the CDC's definition of AIDS to include opportunistic infections that impacted women, poor people, as well as people who use drugs. So it's a very intersectional film. Similarly, I've published work in 2023 in the Journal of History that uses oral history interviews that were collected by some other people for the Canadian AIDS Activist Oral History Project, and explores the kind of uneasy but successful coalitions that were formed in a Canadian context in groups such as ACT UP among pro-choice feminists, racialized communities, people who use drugs, and people who've been incarcerated. I then explore the film Fire in the Blood. So this film explores how once HIV treatment became available in the global north, patents were enforced that made affordability nearly impossible for many nations in the global south. And also discusses activist Zaki Ahmed's treatment strike, where he refused to take his HIV drugs until they were made accessible for all people in South Africa, and he got very, very sick. So this ties into a concept called necrocapitalism, which describes the deadly maldistribution of HIV pharmaceuticals in a way that favors various players in the global north and leads to a loss of countless lives in the global south due to things like ridiculous patent enforcement. This concept of necrocapitalism allows for an understanding of the relationship between the necropolitics of AIDS and the rise of neoliberalism, both of which emerged alongside each other. So again, I want to come back to this question. Well, actually, this is a different question, but I want you to keep this in mind. What if there was an organization like ACT UP for queer suicide prevention? So moving to the third chapter, I argue that understanding queer suicide through a necropolitical lens, similar to how AIDS activists understood the AIDS crisis, is essential for the development of an approach to suicide that uses suicide prevention activism in addition to existing individual care. And so through that chapter, I was looking at publicly available information of various organizations to see if anybody was working on this issue structurally in Canada. Trans Lifeline is not exactly what I'm getting at, but they come very close. They blend the individual and the structural through the use of both a helpline as well as microgrants to cover the cost of name changes and gender changes on documents, and to cover electrolysis for hair removal, and to provide commissary for post-release funds for trans people who've been to prison. Dean Spade talks about something called administrative violence that ties in really nicely here. It's this idea that traditionally gay and lesbian activism was focusing on things like achieving human rights protections, and human rights protections are very difficult to win anyways, and it's very difficult to prove a discrimination case. So as a legal academic, Dean Spade was saying maybe our efforts would be better spent on tackling administrative violence, such as making it easier for people to change their name and gender on documents. And Trans Lifeline does this a bit. They also have a policy that's very interesting against non-consensual active rescue, which means that unlike most suicide helplines, they will not call 911 on a caller unless the caller specifically asks them to do so, because they recognize that calling the police, who may not be trained on suicide prevention, brings in people who could put the caller at risk of racist and homophobic and transphobic police violence and murder. And so they're recognizing that maybe the people on the phone who are actually trained in suicide prevention are the best to deal with it, rather than the people with guns. I also discussed the It Gets Better project. So the It Gets Better project is an NGO that was created by Dan Savage and his husband, Terry Miller, in 2010 to respond to many widely publicized queer teen suicides. So they did this using YouTube videos as well as an anthology. And the videos would be of adults basically begging the youth in general, queer youth in general, to not kill themselves, with this promise that life will supposedly improve with age. But this doesn't really do much to change the structural conditions that actually make life as a queer person feel unlivable. And what about the queer adults who do not feel like their lives are improving? It really puts the onus on the individual to bear queer phobia and wait until this promised life that may not actually exist. And I discuss queer people's suicide notes, and some of those notes directly name the It Gets Better narrative. So I have a quote from Jasbir Puar here. So during the US AIDS crisis, though it was an international thing, the charge of ACT UP activists was "you are killing us." The "you" being the state, and understood as responsible for addressing the crisis and providing care to its citizens and non-citizens. The "you" is also the social and the political, the broader social and political context in which the homosexual and transgender bodies could be sacrificed to such indifference and neglect. So this "you are killing us" was often a chant at ACT UP protests. By contrast, Dan Savage, the co-founder of the It Gets Better project, does not direct his message to the endemic social and political forces that continue to manifest homophobic and transphobic hatred. Instead, his "you" is the individual. So you are killing yourself, to whom and only whom he credits the survival of gay and trans bullying. In this regard, It Gets Better presumes the end, the aftermath of the AIDS crisis, which is not over, rather than any homage to its ongoing deleterious effects or current situation. So next I'm going to move to some suicide notes. So Jamie Hubley, I'm going to read these out loud because these people died and did not get to say these things out loud themselves. Jamie Hubley in 2011 left a suicide note. He was a 15-year-old gay boy, and he said, "I don't want to wait 3 more years. This hurts too much." So that was part of his suicide note. This is also a quote I'm going to read, which is not part of his suicide note. It was posted on a blog shortly before he died. He says, and there's a lot of expletives in this, and I'm not doing this for shock value. It's just, this is how he wrote it. "I hate being the only openly gay guy in my school. It fucking sucks. I really want to end it, like all of it. I'm not getting better. There's 3 more years of high school left. I've been on 4 different antidepressants. None of them worked. I've been depressed since January. How fucking long is this going to last? People said it gets better. It's fucking bullshit. I go to see a psychologist. What the fuck are they supposed to fucking do? All I do is talk about problems. It doesn't make them disappear. I give up." And this is from Leila Alcorn's suicide note in 2014. She was a 17-year-old trans girl that killed herself. She said, "People say it gets better, but that isn't true in my case. Each day I get worse." So next I have a different quote. This is actually from somebody who died of AIDS-related illness in 1990. This is Vito Rousseau, who I also quoted earlier. He said, "So if I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from homophobia. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from racism. If I'm dying from anything, it's from indifference and red tape, because these are the things that are preventing an end to this crisis." So while I just showed some suicide notes from queer people as well as some other related quotes, this quote from somebody who died of AIDS-related illness is the type of lens that I'm trying to encourage people to apply to queer suicide prevention. I also have a quote from B. Schurer. B. Schurer calls themselves a suicide waiting to happen. And they argue, why are we calling suicide what should be called murder, or at least homicide? Where systemic injustice has translated into sustained trauma, it should be called out and appropriately named: delayed, self-completed murder. So queer suicide can be examined as another site where the cis-hetero death world maims the queer psyche and leaves many queer people debilitated from a slow death of overwhelming trauma. This is a quote from B. Schurer. As far as I know, B. Schurer is currently still alive, but given this quote, I'm not entirely sure. They say, "I'm a suicide waiting to happen. I was murdered when I was born and put into a binary gender box. I was murdered each day, every day in junior high school. when the heavy lids of the metal rubbish containers closed over me, burying me into a reeking abyss of darkness which swallowed me as dehumanized refuse. I was murdered by gossip, exclusion, and ostracism of senior high school and at university, and by the name callings and beatings. Only my body survived by only an inch. After one particular instance of bashing, for now, I was thoroughly and routinely murdered again and again as a young person when Christ looked phlegmatically on from his wooden cross while I was raped. I was murdered many times. I do not ask for sympathy, I ask for respect and action. So far, I survived my murder by becoming another smart-ass scholar, but also more than that, an activist. Against an irreparable loss of meaning, I can only set as purpose the fight against the systems that allowed my murders. I know the shadows, I know they will come. I know eventually I will embrace them as lovers. Until then, I will fight. So this ties into something that Anne Cvetkovich calls political depression, using Fields Tank Chicago's term, which is an affective response of despair to structural inequity. And Cvetkovich discusses the Public Feelings Project, an initiative among queer and feminist scholars that began in 2001 to study the emotional dynamics behind issues such as militarism and imperialism. And the Public Feelings Project explores questions such as how does capitalism feel? And I'm similarly attempting to galvanize a dialogue with this chapter, asking how does queer necropolitics feel? And we saw in the film that I discussed earlier, united in anger, living in this cis-hetero death world, especially during the AIDS crisis, there was a lot of anger, and this was leading to a lot of powerful activism. There are a lot of theories about why people kill themselves. A Buddhist nun who was a retired psychotherapist told me that, I think influenced by Gestalt therapy, there's an understanding that often underneath depression can be a lot of anger, which we saw with United in Anger in the activism, and in United in Anger it was directed outwards. But in the case of suicide, sometimes that anger is directed inwards, and sometimes we're doing to ourselves what we wish we could do to other people who are harming and oppressing us. So that's one theory. So Fields Tank Chicago was a cell of the Public Feelings Project, and they used camp humor similar to that seen in the AIDS crisis in their work through organizing events such as an International Day of the Politically Depressed, where activists wore bathrobes to symbolize how tired they were of protesting against social inequality. Cvetkovich explains that protesters distributed t-shirts and refrigerator magnets that read "depressed, it might be political" in order to depathologize negative feelings so that they can be seen as a possible resource for political action. So here, bad feelings are seen not solely as a symptom of a psychiatric illness, but as a sign that something is seriously wrong with the social context in which the individual lives. And by tapping into those feelings, the necropolitical structures causing them are revealed. And Cvetkovich is not necessarily saying that depression is not a psychiatric illness or that mental illness doesn't exist. She's just saying that there are other ways to understand people's experiences beyond just the Western medical model, which largely depathologizes some of the things that increase depression. Or I mean, rather, depoliticizes those issues. So in the fourth chapter, I explore the complications of the nonprofitization of queer politics, what Muriel Beam calls gay ink, in the context of funding models that lead to the depoliticization of queer movements while considering ways to strategically work both within and outside the nonprofit industrial complex. So I use the fusion of queer necropolitics and what I mentioned earlier, necrocapitalism, to understand how capitalism acts as a mediator, but not the only mediator for the relegation of multiply marginalized queers to premature death while affording life for the more privileged. So a big part of queer necropolitics is looking at how it's certain queers who are relegated to premature death, often multiply marginalized queers, and capitalism plays a huge role in who's more likely to die by AIDS, by suicide, and other causes. So in this chapter, I discuss how government funding of nonprofits, as well as foundation funding, serves to depoliticize movements, and government funding especially serves as a form in which the government can manage political dissent by limiting the potential for queer organizations to do political work. So in Canada, charitable organizations are limited in the type and the amount of political work that they're legally allowed to do. And then in addition to that, receiving government funding can also come with strings attached. So I then discussed the complications of NGOs and charitable foundations by exploring artist and activist Nan Goldin's ACT UP-inspired direct action work on the opioid crisis. And I analyzed necrocapitalism in the film All Beauty and the Bloodshed, or All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, which explores how Nan Goldin advocated for art galleries and museums to stop taking funds from the Sackler family's organization Purdue Pharma, which were the manufacturers of OxyContin. Goldin also advocated for changes to address the suffering of individuals through increased access to safe consumption sites. So there was both advocacy for structural and individual approaches to working on the opioid crisis. And the film shows how AIDS activism can be applied during contemporary times to other issues. Goldin held die-ins at art galleries across the world to protest against the Sackler family, and was successful in getting some of these organizations to refuse the Sackler family's funding and to take their name down from walls at different museums and art galleries. So I also discussed my work at an ASO that had a safe consumption site that received a lot of backlash from a neighborhood group, and certain politicians were repeatedly trying to shut that down. So while I've provided a lot of critique of the nonprofit industrial complex, I'm not necessarily advocating that we get rid of these in general, altogether. I'm just saying that the entirety of a social movement should not be contained in a nonprofit in the way that it currently is in the AIDS crisis. Some trans organizations have also demonstrated that it's possible to change the ways in which things are funded and run. I talked about Trans Lifeline. The Sylvia Rivera Law Project is a good example. They provide free legal services to trans people being discriminated against in their access to identification documents, welfare, shelters, foster care, and healthcare. They provide trans competency training. They work to change policy, and they work on precedent-setting litigation. They're run by and for mostly racialized trans people, and they center around political change rather than charity. They have a collective governance structure that's non-hierarchical. They also operate under a consensus-based decision-making model and have a strong grassroots focus. At one point, actually 30% of their budget was from grassroots organizing. They do, however, take some funds from foundation grants and major gifts, but they attempt to avoid bending to the wills of funders by engaging in ongoing dialogue with funders as to why they're providing certain services if a funder has an issue with a particular program. And they were largely inspired by an organization called the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR. Transvestite is an antiquated term, but that was what was used at the time. This was founded by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, who were homeless trans sex workers. It was a mutual aid group that mixed activism centered around queerphobia, the prison industrial complex, racism, and anti-capitalism with shelter services. They ran shelters by sneaking up to 50 trans people into a single hotel room, into unlocked vehicles, and by squatting in empty buildings. And they did this without government funding or grants from wealthy donors. Instead, they funded STAR through sex work, and they operated from a praxis of compassionate queer motherhood. I'm not necessarily arguing, like I said, that organizations shouldn't take funds, but I think that they should be very selective about the funds that they do take, and I think they need to engage in ongoing dialogue with funders to make sure that their missions are not harmed. It's possible for organizations, for nonprofits to be used to hold funds while being accountable to social movements themselves. Of course, there's some accountability to their funders, but that can't be the only accountability. STAR demonstrates this is also possible. The SRLP that I just mentioned on the last slide demonstrates it. And I also want to note that Marsha P. Johnson, who had a big impact on the queer movement and on the Stonewall riots, her body was found in a river and was ruled a suicide by police. And Marsha's friends noted that she was not suicidal. There was a wound to the back of her head while she was found in the river. David France, the person who directed How to Survive a Plague, also directed a film, The Life and Death of Marsha P. Johnson, which discusses her likely murder, which was highly likely not a suicide. Earlier I mentioned B. Sure argues that suicide should be seen as self-completed murder due to the violence that leads up to one's death. And then interestingly here we have a likely murder that is being painted as a suicide by police. And like I said, there was a wound to the back of her head. So that's notable. So my exploration of queer community post-traumatic growth has led me to use something called asset-based community development, an approach that uses existing community resources and strategies to address challenges in a community, to consider what strengths queers have gained from fighting the AIDS crisis, in addition to other fights like homophobia, and how these might be applied to suicide prevention. And I discuss in the dissertation how notions of community have been problematized among scholars, but ultimately I land on Gayatri Spivak's notion of strategic essentialism, basically concluding that notions of community are necessary in this context if political work is to be taken up. And I really explore this question of, rather than thinking about AIDS and suicide through an individual lens of individual health, as a community, how might we deal with the spectrum of things that make queer life feel unlivable? So the work of the preceding chapters led me to examine this question of queer livability through these 6 issues. And I've arrived at these 6 areas as a result of my work in this dissertation, my professional experiences in various mental health positions and in the HIV sector, my lived experience as well. I briefly in the dissertation explain how these are connected to cis-hetero death worlds and how they may start to be addressed. But I want to note these are not the only things that impact queer livability, obviously, but rather I did this because it serves as a thought experiment for how we might look at queer suicide prevention through a structural focus. And I'm really just encouraging other people to do this type of mapping for things that I haven't thought of. Some of these issues impact queer people specifically, such as familial homophobia and transphobia, and others are not specific to queers, but impact suicide prevention, such as poverty. And again, it's kind of an exercise for future work. So these areas are familial homophobia and transphobia, poverty, healthcare, education, lateral violence, which is when oppressed communities hurt each other rather than fighting oppression, and administrative violence. And it's very important that these are looked at with an intersectional focus, just like ACT UP used to do. I'm highly influenced by Dean Spade's work on trickle-up social justice praxis. So this is a strategy to address the dominance of the concerns of privileged white trans people within trans politics. So he would argue that currently we have this trickle-down approach where we're addressing the needs of the most privileged first, and then assuming that those benefits will trickle down to multiply marginalized trans people, and that's not necessarily the case. And he argues that trickle-up social justice suggests that the concerns of the most privileged, the most marginalized rather, must be addressed first. The concerns of the people who are experiencing the most suffering. And the benefits of those will inevitably trickle up and benefit the more privileged and will lead to a more equitable distribution of life chances for all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at these 6 areas that I mentioned. I'm going to narrow the focus to look at these in the context of suicide among trans youth. I discuss sort of what the stakes are currently for trans youth in order to kind of galvanize some action on these issues, though the dissertation is about queer people broadly. There was a researcher, De Gagne, who argues that social conservatism has merged with neoliberalism in debates over trans rights in Canada. And this political discourse is certainly a symptom of already existing transphobia in Canada, despite what homonationalism would like us to believe, but it also serves to exacerbate it. So if increasing transphobic political discourse leads to more family rejections of trans youth, there could be dire consequences. The Transpulse Ontario study found that parental support lowered suicidality for trans Ontarians, and this spotlights how familial homophobia continues to create conditions that function necropolitically for this population. So when Sarah Schulman coined this term of familial homophobia, she was trying to say that we're not talking about individual bad apples of families who are some exception to the norm, who are transphobic. Part of that lens in itself perpetuates the issue. This is a cultural crisis. So when she talks about familial homophobia, she's not talking about individual families. She's talking about familial homophobia broadly. And we need a culture shift if this is going to change ever. Trans youth are disproportionately represented among Canadians experiencing poverty, probably partially due to family rejection, and trans homeless youth experience poorer mental health outcomes than cisgender homeless youth. These income disparities are highly worsened for racialized trans people and two-spirit people, and trans Canadians are vulnerable to homelessness and experience challenges such as transphobia in shelters. And trans Canadians living in poverty experience poor health outcomes and greater challenges accessing healthcare. Some researchers surveyed Canadian medical students and found that 95% agreed that transgender issues should be addressed by physicians, but less than 10% felt sufficiently knowledgeable to do so. This is especially important as Bauer and colleagues identified that access to medical transition for those who desired it could reduce the suicides of trans Ontarians. Such access, which is already sparse, may soon disappear for trans youth as Canadian conservative politicians such as Pierre Poilievre and Danielle Smith are in favor of banning trans healthcare for youth. And the current leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, Pierre Poilievre, does not believe that queer and trans issues should be taught in schools. In the context of lateral violence, transnormativity is a form of lateral violence in which binary notions of medical transition are hailed as the only legitimate manner of trans being, and a lack of education on the legitimacy of non-binary identities could lead to transphobic bullying from both cisgender youth as well as transnormative lateral violence between binary trans youth and non-binary young people. Saskatchewan and New Brunswick being where the 8 people I know who've killed themselves are from, have adopted what are called blanket veto and disclosure laws, which require parents to be informed if a child attempts to change their name and pronoun at school, and that such changes cannot be made without parental consent. A researcher, Ashley, explained that political discourse in Ontario suggests that this province will likely be the next to follow suit. And of course, these blanket veto and disclosure laws risk outing trans children, which leads to family rejection and homelessness often. And this dangerous form of education-based administrative violence shows the interconnectedness of the 6 areas that I explored. Current political discourse around trans youth operates in a way that creates a cis-death world, and this underscores the urgency that we act structurally, because this has deadly consequences for young trans people. So, though I don't naively expect this dissertation alone to dramatically change the landscape of queer suicide prevention, summoning the ghosts of AIDS activism has provided me with a small amount of hope that alternative methods of enhancing queer livability beyond simply asking people to wait for things to get better are possible. So for this reason, I offer a short meditation on hope to conclude. Svetkovich explains how Feels Tank Chicago's concept of political depression is not meant to be depressing, but rather can inspire hope for working on discontent with structural issues. And similarly, my choice to explore suicide structurally and to examine queer community assets rather than deficits is intended to provide hope for reparative possibilities. Sedgwick asserts that hope, often a fracturing and even traumatic thing to experience, is among the energies by which the reparatively positioned reader tries to organize the fragments and part objects she encounters or creates. And perhaps hope is a traumatic thing to experience because it requires coming to terms with the challenges of the past and present. And similarly, hoping for a better future is insufficient, and hope without action, it can be a form of cruel optimism. Johanna Macy and Chris Johnston discuss hope in the context of climate change, and they distinguish between passive hope, which is basically wishful thinking, and active hope, which involves knowing that a better future is possible and becoming directly involved in creating that future. And what I'm actively hoping for is it could be described as a queer utopia. As Munoz explains, the here and now is a prison house. Queerness is essentially about a rejection of a here and now and an insistence on potentiality or concrete possibility for another world. Though I would argue that the here and now should not be avoided, though it can feel like a prison house, but rather it can be tapped into, because by feeling the suffering of the present and reflecting on assets gained from the past, we can access wisdom on how and what to ameliorate for the future. So Munoz states, my approach to hope as a critical methodology can be best described as a backward glance that enacts a future vision. And it's with these words that I conclude this talk. I've given an extensive backward glance, summoning the metaphorical ghosts of AIDS history, and it's my active hope that this will spark ideas in the readers of the dissertation, people who are viewing this talk, as to other ways that a backward glance can inspire hope to build a concrete utopia where queer people actually want to live. So I'm going to stop sharing that part of my screen, and I'm just going to briefly move through these references. I'm probably going to put the talk on YouTube, so if you want to examine some of these references, then when the link is up, you'll be able to pause the video. And that's all. Thank you very much for your time, everyone.